Time is the only thing we cannot manufacture. Yet, in the late 19th century, humanity became obsessed with measuring it to the fraction of a second. By 1894, the world was accelerating. Steamships crossed the Atlantic in record time. Railways threaded together distant cities, demanding a synchronization that had never before been necessary in human history. It was an era of noise, the rhythmic thud of pistons, the hiss of steam, and the relentless, mechanical ticking of the millions of clocks that governed the new industrial age. But in the winter of that year, a peculiar order was placed with a precision engineering firm in the outskirts of London. The order was not for a grand cathedral clock or a pocket watch for a gentleman. It was for 300 identical units. They were encased in polished mahogany and brass, yet they possessed a feature, or perhaps a lack thereof, that defied the logic of the period. They were designed to be entirely, unnervingly silent. In the 1890s, silence in machinery was often a sign of failure. A clock that did not tick was a clock that had stopped. Yet, these 300 instruments were masterpieces of frictionless movement. They were built with a specialized, modified escapement that allowed the hands to sweep across the dial in a single, fluid motion, devoid of the staccato heartbeat that defined every other timepiece of the era. Records from the workshop suggest that the craftsmanship was of the highest possible caliber, requiring the labor of dozens of master horologists. But when the clocks were finished, they were not sold to the public. They were crated, numbered, and moved into the shadows of history. There is no record of who paid for them. There is no ledger entry detailing their destination. For over a century, the story of the 1,894 silent clocks remained a footnote in the archives of a defunct manufacturing firm until a single crate was discovered in a basement in Bristol in the summer of 1972. Inside that crate sat unit number 142. It was in pristine condition, its brass still gleaming through a layer of century-old dust. When it was wound, it began its ghostly, silent transit. It didn't belong in a home, and it didn't belong in a factory. It was a machine designed to measure time in a void. But as researchers began to look for the other 299 units, they realized that the paper trail didn't just go cold, it had been systematically erased. To understand why someone would commission 300 silent clocks, we have to understand the world as it existed in 1894. This was the year the Greenwich Meridian was becoming the undisputed center of time for the British Empire and much of the Western world. Standardization was the obsession of the decade. Before this, every town kept its own time based on the sun. When it was noon in London, it might be 12, 5 inches, Reading, and 12, 15 inches, Bristol. The railways changed that. A train cannot run on local solar time without risking a head-on collision. Historians believe that the silent clocks were part of a larger, perhaps government-funded project to test long-distance synchronization. In a world before radio or digital signals, the only way to ensure two clocks miles apart were perfectly aligned was to observe a visual signal or to move a master clock between them. But a ticking clock is subject to mechanical vibration. A silent clock, using a continuous motion escapement, is theoretically more stable. However, 300 units is an excessive number for a simple scientific experiment. If these were meant for the Royal Navy or the British rail system, there would be an official requisition form. There would be a budget line in the parliamentary archives. Instead, there is only a cryptic note found in the personal diary of one of the lead clockmakers, a man named Arthur Penhaligon. In October 1894 he wrote, "The silence of the workshop is becoming unbearable. We are building ghosts to measure a time that does not yet exist." What Penhaligon meant by a time that does not yet exist remains a subject of intense debate among horologists. Some suggest he was referring to the upcoming turn of the century, a period of immense anxiety and technological anticipation. Others believe the clocks weren't meant to measure the time we know at all. What happened next began to shift the narrative entirely. In the late 1990s, as digital archives made it easier to cross-reference historical manifests, a researcher in Edinburgh found a mention of a specialized consignment arriving at a remote naval outpost in the North Atlantic in late 1894. The shipment consisted of 12 heavy crates, all marked with the same serial number sequence found on Unit 142, but the outpost wasn't a lighthouse or a navigational station. It was a telegraphic relay point, a place where cables from the seabed surfaced before diving back into the dark water. It was here that the first real clue emerged. The silent clocks weren't just silent, they were built to be shielded. When the Bristol unit was dismantled for study in 1975, The technicians found a layer of lead lining the interior of the mahogany case. In 1894, lead was primarily used for weight, but this was a thin, deliberate sheeting. It was as if the creators were trying to protect the clock's internal mechanism from something, or perhaps protect the outside world from the clock. This discovery led to a re-examination of the few surviving documents from the Penhaligon workshop. It was discovered that the 300 clocks were delivered in small batches of 12 to 25. They were sent to seemingly random locations: a monastery in the Swiss Alps, a private estate in the Scottish Highlands, a diplomatic building in Ottoman-controlled Sofia, and a series of nondescript warehouses in port cities like Singapore and New York. There is no clear consensus on what linked these locations. They were not on a single trade route. They were not all under British control. But they did share one commonality. They were all points of extreme isolation or high-security communication. As the 20th century progressed, the clocks began to vanish. The Swiss monastery was destroyed in an avalanche in 1912. The Sofia building was leveled during the First World War. In almost every instance where a silent clock was known to be held, the records were lost to fire, war, or simple negligence. It was as if the clocks were being erased from the physical world as effectively as they had been erased from the ledgers. But then, a photograph surfaced from a private collection in 2004. It was a black and white image taken in 1921 inside a secure room at the Paris Observatory. In the background, partially obscured by a heavy curtain, stands a mahogany cabinet identical to the one found in Bristol. The caption on the back of the photo, written in faded ink, reads, "The 1894 Standard. Waiting for the pulse." The mention of a pulse adds a layer of complexity that early researchers hadn't considered. In the 1890s, the study of electromagnetism was in its infancy. Tesla, Marconi, and Hertz were just beginning to understand how waves could travel through the air. If the clocks were meant to work in unison, they would need a way to communicate. But there were no wires, and the technology for wireless synchronization wouldn't be refined for another decade. And yet, when the Bristol clock was tested using modern sensors, it revealed a hidden gear made not of brass or steel, but of a specific bismuth alloy. Bismuth is a diamagnetic metal. In 1894, its properties were known but rarely utilized in clockmaking because it is brittle and difficult to work with. There is no logical reason to use it in a timekeeping mechanism unless you are trying to make the device sensitive to magnetic fluctuations. This discovery changed the perspective of the investigation. The question was no longer why the clocks were silent, but what they were actually listening for. If the 300 clocks were designed to detect magnetic fluctuations, the silent, frictionless movement becomes less of an aesthetic choice and more of a technical necessity. In a standard clock, the mechanical vibration of the ticking, the physical shock of the pallet hitting the escape wheel, creates a minute amount of kinetic interference. For an instrument designed to measure the invisible forces of the Earth's magnetic field, that tiny vibration would be like trying to hear a whisper in a thunderstorm. By removing the sound, the creators removed the interference. But this leads to a troubling question. Who in 1894 was sophisticated enough to realize that a global network of magnetic sensors was needed, and more importantly, what were they expecting to happen? Records from the British Admiralty during this period show an unusual spike in funding for experimental telegraphy, yet the silent clocks are never mentioned by name. Instead, they appear in shipping manifests as chronometric ballast. It is a term that suggests they were meant to be heavy, stable, and ignored. In 1992, a retired archivist from the Royal Society, Dr. Alistair Finch, began tracing the specific coordinates of the locations where the clocks had been sent. Using early GPS mapping, he found a pattern that had been invisible to researchers in the 19th century. The clocks were not placed randomly. They were positioned along the lines of what we now know as magnetic declination, the points on the Earth where the magnetic north and true north align or diverge in specific, predictable ways. Finch's research suggested that the 300 clocks were part of a massive, silent grid. If one clock's movement slowed or accelerated by even a fraction of a second, and that change was mirrored by another clock 5,000 miles away, it would indicate a shift in the planet's magnetic core. But the technology to observe these minute changes in real time didn't exist in 1894. The clocks would have to be checked manually, their data recorded in logs, and those logs sent back to a central hub. Yet, no such logs have ever been found, and that's when things began to shift. In 2011, a discovery was made in an estate sale in Vermont. A small, leather-bound ledger belonged to a man named Thomas Vance, a former clerk for the Penhaligon firm. The ledger was mostly filled with mundane accounting costs for brass, wages for apprentices, but the final 3 pages were written in a frantic, cramped hand. Vance describes a meeting that took place in November 1894, just weeks before the final clocks were shipped. He describes a group of men who arrived at the workshop after dark. They weren't government officials, and they weren't scientists. Vance described them as men of the cable representatives from the burgeoning global telecommunications industry, the ones responsible for laying the copper nerves across the ocean floor. According to Vance, these men weren't interested in the clock's ability to tell time. They were interested in their ability to stop it. Vance writes, "They spoke of a surge, a day when the wires would sing without electricity and the needles would spin without magnets. They said the 300 would be the only things left that knew the truth of the hour." This passage has led some historians to believe the project was a private insurance policy against a solar event. In 1859, the Carrington event, a massive solar flare, had fried telegraph lines and caused auroras to be seen as far south as the Caribbean. By 1894, the world was far more dependent on electricity than it had been in 1859. If another such event occurred, the entire global infrastructure would collapse. The silent, lead-shielded clocks, immune to magnetic interference and mechanical vibration, would be the only reliable way to resynchronize the world after the surge. But if this was a safeguard against a solar storm, why was it kept so secret? And why were the clocks abandoned? There is no record of a major solar event in 1894 or 1895. The surge the men of the cable feared never arrived. Or, perhaps, it did, but not in the way they expected. What happened next changed the narrative entirely. As researchers dug deeper into the history of the shipping port in Singapore, one of the known destinations for a batch of 24 clocks, they found a series of police reports from January 1895. Local authorities were called to a warehouse near the docks after neighbors reported a low, hummed vibration that seemed to be vibrating the very air around the building. When the police forced entry, they found the warehouse empty of people, but the crates containing the silent clocks had been opened. The report notes that the clocks were not stolen. They were still there, all 24 of them, arranged in a perfect circle on the floor, but they were no longer silent. The officers described a sound like 1,000 bees trapped in a jar. Every single clock had accelerated. The hands were spinning so fast they were a blur. And then, as the officers watched, the clocks stopped simultaneously. When the mechanisms were later inspected by a local watchmaker, he found that the bismuth gears had literally melted. The internal temperature required to melt that alloy would have been high enough to char the mahogany cases, yet the wood was cold to the touch. The watchmaker's conclusion was that the clocks hadn't failed due to heat, they had failed due to a massive, localized discharge of kinetic energy. This incident in Singapore was not isolated. Similar reports of mechanical failure accompanied by sound surfaced in the archives of the Sofia Diplomatic Building and the Scottish Estate. In every instance, the clocks were found to have accelerated and then died at the exact same moment, 4:12 a.m., Greenwich Mean Time, on the 14th of January 1895. This date, however, holds no significance in the history of astronomy or meteorology. There were no solar flares recorded that day, no earthquakes, no volcanic eruptions. To the rest of the world, the 14th of January 1895 was an ordinary, quiet Tuesday. But for the 300 silent clocks, it was the end of their utility. The aftermath of the Singapore incident saw a total shutdown of the project. The Penhaligon firm declared bankruptcy shortly after, and Arthur Penhaligon himself disappeared from public life. Some records suggest he moved to a remote part of Cornwall, where he spent the rest of his days refusing to have a single timepiece in his home. By the turn of the century, the 300 clocks were largely forgotten, sold off for parts or left to rot in basements. But as modern horologists began to track down the remaining units in the 21st century, they found something that didn't add up. If the clocks were destroyed by a pulse in 1895, then Unit 142, the clock found in the Bristol basement in 1972, shouldn't have been working. Yet, it was. When it was discovered, it was ticking, or rather, sweeping perfectly. This implies one of two things. Either Unit 142 was never deployed, or it was somehow shielded from whatever happened on that January morning. When the Bristol unit was subjected to a modern carbon dating of the wood and a metallurgical analysis of the brass, the results were unsettling. The mahogany case was indeed from the late 19th century, But the bismuth gears inside Unit 142 showed signs of isotopic decay that are usually only found in materials exposed to high-altitude radiation. It was as if this particular clock hadn't been in a basement at all. It was as if it had been somewhere else, somewhere far above the Earth's atmosphere. This led a team of independent researchers in 2018 to revisit the men of the cable theory. They began to look not at where the clocks were sent, but at who was transporting them. They found that several of the ships carrying the clocks were owned by a subsidiary of a company involved in early atmospheric ballooning experiments. The pieces were beginning to form a new, much stranger picture. The 300 clocks weren't just a ground-based grid, they were a three-dimensional map. Some were meant for the depths of the sea, some for the surface, and some, it seems, were meant for the sky. But the most chilling piece of evidence was yet to be uncovered. In 2022, a digital scan of a private diary belonging to a French astronomer was released to the public. In an entry dated the 15th of January, 1895, the day after the clocks failed, he wrote about a luminous ripple he had observed through his telescope. He described it as a shimmering in the dark of the moon, a distortion of light that lasted for exactly 3 seconds. He noted that he felt a brief, inexplicable sense of vertigo as he watched it. He dismissed it as an optical illusion or a personal dizzy spell, but he was not the only one who felt it. Reports of this global vertigo began to emerge from the most unlikely of places. In the logbooks of the SS Gothic, which was crossing the Indian Ocean on that same January morning, the captain noted a sudden, sickening sensation among the crew, a feeling as if the horizon had momentarily tilted by several degrees. In London, a handful of patients in a high-security ward at Bethlehem Royal Hospital reportedly fell into a simultaneous state of catatonic silence, lasting for exactly 3 minutes. To the medical and maritime communities of 1,895, these were isolated incidents, dismissed as mass hysteria or the effects of poor ventilation. But to the men who had commissioned the 300 clocks, these were the data points they had been waiting for. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 2023, a team of horological forensic experts at a university in Munich was granted access to Unit 142. They used a technique called muon tomography, a non-invasive imaging method that uses cosmic ray particles to see through dense materials like lead and mahogany. The scans revealed that the clock's interior was far more complex than a simple movement. Hidden within the base of the cabinet, encased in a vacuum-sealed glass tube, was a secondary pendulum. It was made of a strange iridescent material that did not match any alloy known to late Victorian metallurgy. But the most shocking discovery was the way this secondary pendulum was mounted. It wasn't attached to the clock's mechanical gears. Instead, it was suspended by a series of microscopic gold filaments, designed to react to the Earth's gravitational pull with extreme sensitivity. The 300 clocks weren't just chronometers, they were gravimeters. This realization led researchers to a startling new hypothesis. If the 300 units were placed at specific points around the globe, and if they were all capable of measuring minute fluctuations in gravity, then their silence was essential. Any mechanical noise would have drowned out the signal they were designed to catch. In 1894, someone, perhaps a clandestine group within the British scientific establishment, suspected that the Earth's gravity was not a constant. They believed that something was passing through our solar system, or perhaps through our very reality, that would ripple the fabric of space-time. And on the 14th of January, 1895, at 4:12 a.m., that ripple arrived. The men of the cable weren't trying to protect the telegraph lines from a solar storm. They were trying to use the global telegraph network as a giant antenna to capture the gravitational data recorded by the 300 clocks. The pulse the Paris astronomer saw, the bees in a jar sound in Singapore, and the melting of the bismuth gears, these were all symptoms of a massive, sudden surge in gravitational energy. The clocks hadn't failed. They had been overwhelmed by the very thing they were built to detect. But this raises the most uncomfortable question of all. If a gravitational event of that magnitude occurred in 1895, why isn't it in our history books? Some historians believe the silence was intentional. If the event had been made public, it would have shattered the foundations of Newtonian physics and Victorian certainty. The idea that the Earth itself could be tilted or stretched by an external force was too terrifying for a world already on the brink of a new century. The project was scrubbed, the clocks were scattered, and the men involved were sworn to a silence as profound as the instruments they created. What happened to the remaining clocks remains one of the great mysteries of modern archaeology. Of the original 300, only 7 have been officially accounted for. Two are in private collections in Japan. One is rumored to be in a vault in the Vatican, and Unit 142 resides in a climate-controlled room in Germany. The other 293 have vanished into the fog of time. There are stories, however. Unconfirmed reports of silent cabinets found in the wreckage of 20th century shipwrecks, or mahogany boxes discovered in the ruins of colonial-era buildings in Africa and South America. In each case, the clocks are found to be dead, their internal gears fused into a single, unmovable mass of bismuth and brass. In 2024, a new lead emerged. A retired engineer from the British Antarctic Survey claimed that during a deep ice drilling project in the 1980s, his team struck a metallic object nearly 200 feet below the surface. They were unable to retrieve it, but the radar scans showed a shape that was unmistakable. A rectangular cabinet, roughly 4 feet tall, with a circular indentation at the top. If a silent clock is buried beneath the Antarctic ice, it suggests the grid was even larger and more ambitious than anyone had imagined. Modern re-examination of the 1,895 data suggests that the event may not have been a one-time occurrence. Some theoretical physicists have pointed out that the 130-year cycle of the 300 clocks' creation and disappearance aligns with certain celestial alignments that are due to repeat in the coming decades. If Arthur Penhaligon and his mysterious patrons were building a warning system, the question is no longer why they built it, but what they were warning us about. Penhaligon's final known letter, written to his daughter shortly before his death in 1910, contains a single, haunting sentence that researchers are still trying to decode. He wrote, "We measured the shadow of the giant, and the giant did not even know we were there. But the shadow will return, and the next time, the clocks will not be silent." Today, Unit 142 sits in its glass case, its hands sweeping across the dial in that eerie, fluid motion. It is a masterpiece of a lost science, a relic of a time when the world's greatest minds were looking for the heartbeat of the universe itself. It remains the only one of the 300 that still functions, the only one that survived the pulse of 1,895. As we look back at the records of that winter, the maps, the letters, and the scorched gears of the few surviving units, we are left with a choice. We can believe that the 300 clocks were a failed experiment in synchronization, a Victorian folly born of over-ambition and too much brass. Or we can consider the possibility that for 3 seconds in the winter of 1,894, the world experienced something that defied all logic, and that somewhere, in a basement or a vault we have yet to find, another one of Penhaligon's ghosts is waiting to tell us the truth. History is written in the sounds we choose to remember, the roar of engines, the cheers of crowds, the ticking of the clock. But sometimes, the most important stories are the ones told in total silence. What happened on that January morning remains unclear, and perhaps it is better that way. For now, the silent clocks of 1,894 remain a testament to the things we cannot see, the forces we cannot control, and the time we can never truly measure. The grid may be broken, and the creators may be long gone, but the mystery of the 300 remains a quiet, mahogany-encased reminder that the universe is far larger and far stranger than we dare to imagine.